From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress, and thank you for joining us today for one of several talks that are going on at the Library of Congress, and we're pleased to have you here. I'm John Cole. I am the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading promotion arm of the library. And we have a network of state centers for the book around the country that help us promote books and reading and literacy in libraries. We also work closely with nonprofits that are interested in the same areas. Plus, we encourage the study of the history of books as part of this grand endeavor. In Washington, D.C., we are closely connected with the National Book Festival, which is why you see a poster representing the last book festival when you came in. We are the author content coordinators, and pleased to have that as part of our program here in Washington. In addition, we host Books and Beyond, the program you're attending today, which consists of books that are of have a special relationship to the Library of Congress and the Library of Congress's collections. And as book promoters, we take special pride in being able to show a wonderful product has come out of research not only from the Library of Congress, but from other libraries and organizations around the country. All of our talks are really broadcast eventually on the webcast, a webcast broadcast on the Library of Congress website. And so for that reason, I need to remind people to turn off all things electronic and to sit back and enjoy a tour of a wonderful job of research, which you will learn about, and you will also learn about a very interesting character. We also have a second-time speaker in the Books and Beyond program. Peter Bridges is the author. I think this is Peter's third book, but he was a speaker in this series a couple of years ago when he did a biography of John Moncure Daniel called Pen of Fire, and this was the first biography of an American diplomat and a Confederate editor. And his interest today, you'll see, is also in a related time period. Peter comes to authorship by way of the U.S. Foreign Service. He was commissioned as a career Foreign Service officer in 1957. And during 3 decades in the Foreign Service, he served in many different capacities, including the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and as Executive Secretary of the Treasury Department. He served overseas in American embassies in what is an impressive list: Panama, Moscow, Prague, Rome, and in 1981 to 1984, where he was the chief of mission. 1981 to 84, he was the actual ambassador to Somalia. Peter, I'm getting that mixed up. It's 84 to 86. He was in Somalia. You know, Wikipedia just doesn't do a good job editorially in putting this together in the way they should. But at any rate, we're really pleased that he can be here for his second appearance, and I am very pleased to welcome Peter Bridges. Help me welcome him.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cole. I'm delighted to have a chance to speak here for a second time. It's a great library, and I'm very grateful to the Center for the Book and its director for making it possible. This new book certainly would not have been possible at all without the things that I have found in the Library of Congress. I've spent more hours than I can count, more days than I can count, in the main reading room and the manuscript reading room and the newspaper and current periodical reading room and a lot of other reading rooms too. And I also want to express my thanks to the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training and its publications director, Marjorie Thompson. ADST has kindly made my book the latest in the series on diplomats and diplomacy that it co-sponsors with DACOR, which is an organization of mainly retired foreign affairs people. The subject of my book that I want to talk to you about today is a man who had a rare name, Donn Piatt. It's a name you don't forget when you hear it, even though if you don't know how to spell it. It's a Huguenot name, Piatt, but Donn with two N's is something different. In fact, he was originally named Donn Piatt. One of his aunts had married a Mr. Donn. But then young Piatt's father had a falling out with the Donn family. His father had a fiery temper, which was inherited by his son. And so he decided he didn't want his son to be a Donn, and he renamed him Donn, still with two N's. He had not just a rare name, but a famous one. In his heyday, it was famous, and that was the Gilded Age. That was the time after the Civil War when America boomed and fortunes multiplied, when many Americans remained poor, and many of them desperately poor. It was a time of growing inequality in our society, and it was also a time of corruption in high places. You might say it was a little bit like our own time. Donn Piatt made his national name here in Washington, lambasting lobbyists and corrupt members of Congress and corrupt members of President U.S. Grant's own cabinet, and attacking U.S. Grant himself as a hard drinker, a man who was utterly beholden to the millionaires, and a chief executive who didn't care about learning his job. And he did this, Piatt did this in his newspaper that he called The Capital. And for years, he played a key role in influencing American opinion. Now, his paper never had a huge circulation like, say, his friend Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, but it was the biggest, and I think the best of a number of Washington weeklies of the time. Modest circulation or not, what Piatt wrote in his paper was quoted and reprinted in big and small papers all around this country. I'll remind you that although the Transcontinental Railroad was not finished until 1869, why the telegraph system spanned the country from coast to coast by the end of 1861. And the content of many small-town papers was made up largely of what they took off the wires. And people liked to read Piatt because he had a style that was mocking and sometimes was downright funny. He made fun of both Protestants and Catholics. He said the difference between Mormons and congressmen was that the Mormons married their mistresses. He said the Democratic Party was the organized ignorance of the country, and the Republicans were the organized greed. And he wrote that there were all too many congressmen who would stand up in the House and say, "Mr. Speaker, in the name of God, amen, let's go rob somebody." And he kept on saying these things until he died. He said it was better to wear out than to rust out. Even in the year of his death, 1891, having sold his own paper, he published a dozen slashing articles on national issues in one of the big Midwestern dailies. He had a lot of friends, including men who were destined to be presidents like Rutherford Hayes and James Garfield. But he wasn't above criticizing them, too, and he did that. Piatt and Garfield were intimate friends for years from the time the two of them had come to Washington and roomed together before their wives arrived. And Garfield's diaries are full of entries about horseback rides and dinners and long talks with Donn Piatt. But Garfield also wrote in his diary that Piatt had a strange way of treating his friends. And in fact, Piatt gave at best a very lukewarm defense of Garfield when Garfield was accused of taking a bribe in the huge Crédit Mobilier scandal that had to do with the Union Pacific Railroad. And later still, after Garfield had been elected president, Piatt wrote in his paper that during the scandal, Garfield had contemplated suicide, and that ended the friendship between Garfield and Piatt. But Piatt had even more enemies than he did friends. One day after Piatt's paper had had the temerity to criticize the wife of President Grant, one of Grant's brothers-in-law and one of Grant's sons came calling at Piatt's house. It was on the corner of 18th and F Streets, just west of the White House. They came calling armed with heavy sticks. And they didn't find Piatt home, but they badly scared his wife. The next day, Piatt wrote in the Capitol that next time he'd prefer to see him in his office, and he published his address and his office hours. Well, they didn't come. But on another day, a drunken senator, Zachariah Chandler, one of the founders of the Republican Party from Michigan, why Chandler came looking for him with a large pistol. And then another evening, he was knocked down in a Senate anteroom by a lobbyist who had repeatedly been attacked in Piatt's paper. So perhaps you can begin to see that he had an interesting life, Donn Piatt. I think perhaps he was intemperate. I think he probably would have gone higher in life if he had restrained himself more. But in any case, he was brave as well as outspoken. After Senator Chandler came gunning for him, but went to the wrong newspaper office, being a bit apparently befuddled, Piatt published his correct address, and he said he wanted the senator to know his schedule, and I quote, "We kill senators on Monday. Wednesday, we fight members of the House. But we protest any intrusion on Friday or Saturday because some time has to be given to editing our insults." I said that Piatt had not just enemies, but lots of friends. One of his close friends was also his brother-in-law. That was Henry Banning, an Ohio Republican who was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1873 and eventually became chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs. Now, Piatt could make fun of himself as well as of others. He liked to tell the story that when Banning was first running for Congress, he went to him and said, "Henry, I'd be happy to make some speeches for you." And Banning said thank you, and he lined up 20 appearances for Piatt. And then Piatt found that the first appearance was going to be the day after the election. And speaking of humor, Piatt was for a time a good friend of that great humorist, Mark Twain. The two of them met in Washington at dinner in 1871, and each of them took a considerable liking to the other. Now, at that point, Mark Twain, among other things, was writing a monthly column for The Galaxy, which was a well-known magazine. But then his little son died, his father-in-law, whom he was very close to, died. His wife, Olivia, came down with typhoid fever, and what Twain then started writing for the magazine began to look, as he said himself, more like a funeral oration than humor. So he got Donn Piatt to step in for him, and Piatt made quite a success of his column in The Galaxy. But the friendship did not continue. In 1873, Twain and his friend Charles Dudley Warner co-authored a novel called The Gilded Age, which, although it gave its name to that period in America, was really not a great work of fiction. Piatt ignored Twain's book in his newspaper, although we know that Mark Twain was hoping for a favorable review. Piatt just said nothing about it. Then, when the book was turned into a play on Broadway and then in Washington, why, Piatt wrote very disparagingly about the play. He said the big laughs came at places in the play that weren't supposed to be funny. And that ended the Twain-Piatt friendship. Another of Piatt's friendships, and this an enduring one, was with Ainsworth Spofford, the founder of the Literary Club of Cincinnati, which exists today. A club that Donn Piatt joined when he was a young lawyer and writer in Cincinnati. And the two men's friendship, Piatt's and Spofford's, continued after they'd both come to Washington. Piatt as a journalist in 1868, and Spofford as a young journalist who became the sixth, and I think perhaps the first really great librarian of Congress. I first came on the name of Ainsworth Spofford when I was beginning to look into the life of Donn Piatt. And I soon found a rich resource, which was the doctoral dissertation about Spofford, written by John Y. Cole. And if you want to know the story not only of Ainsworth Spofford, but of this library, why, you'll want to read Dr. Cole's many books and articles on this place and on that man. But it's going to take you a while. The last time I looked at the list of his publications, it was about 24 pages long. Back now to Mr. Piatt. He was a real polymath, a man who in his long life not only made a lot of friends and enemies, but enjoyed a lot of professions and interests. He was born in Ohio in 1819, and he died there in 1891 at the age of 72. That was a long life, at least for his times, says his biographer, who's just turned 80. But before I tell you more about Piatt's life, I want to tell you how I got interested in the man to begin with. And it started in Rome, a place that Piatt never visited. And I myself served twice in the American Embassy in Rome. And in the embassy's protocol office, there was and is a line of photographs of the past American envoys to Italy. And I always noticed that a fellow named George Perkins Marsh had the best beard and the longest term of service, 21 years. Well, it took me quite a long time to learn that Mr. Marsh had also been the author of the first great American work on the environment, Man and Nature, which was first published in 1864 and is still in print today after 148 years. Like Donn Piatt, George Marsh was a man of many facets, many interests, and eventually I wrote an essay about him for the Virginia Quarterly Review that I called The Polymath from Vermont. Marsh was also an abolitionist from Vermont, and he was sent to Italy by President Lincoln. And then I discovered that Marsh's diplomatic predecessor in Italy was a racist from Virginia, a certain John Moncure Daniel. Well, I don't care for racists, but I found that Daniel had done a first-rate job representing the United States for 7 years in Italy as a diplomat before the Civil War broke out, and he returned to Richmond to become the most influential editor in the Confederacy. And then I found that nobody had written a full biography of Daniel, so I did it, and I did my best, at least, to provide a true picture of the man, even if I didn't like him. And then, and it's kind of a long tale, but I think it's a logical progression, I came on this fellow named Donn Piatt, who was the number 2 in the American legation in Paris, while John Daniel was number 1 in Italy. We didn't have any embassies back then. We pretended to want only a modest diplomatic presence abroad. So instead of an embassy in a foreign capital, we had a legation. And legations are headed, we don't have any more legations, but they were headed by a person with the rank not of ambassador, but the title of minister. Piatt's boss, as minister in Paris, was another Virginian, a man named John Y. Mason, a former cabinet member, who was a good friend of his Virginian friend across the Alps, John Moncure Daniel. Well, what I initially read about Donn Piatt in the correspondence between the two Virginians was not very favorable. But then I found that when Mason had had a couple of strokes and Piatt had taken over the legation, he ran it better than Mason had ever done. Not least because Piatt spoke good French and Mason spoke none, and not least because Piatt and his wife Louise had made friends with a number of influential people in France, while Mason mainly liked to go around with rich Americans living in Paris, who Louise Piatt wrote, they mainly wished that they could buy themselves titles of nobility. And then there was a difference between the two over slavery. Mason was a Virginia slave owner, and Donn Piatt was always strongly anti-slavery. And next I discovered all the other things besides diplomacy and foreign affairs that Piatt had worked on over the years. And better yet, I found that nobody had written a biography of the man since 1893, 2 years after he died. The first biography had been financed by Piatt's widow, and I will say that it was a little bit too full of praise for the man. On the other hand, I found that a certain professor who has written a lot about the American press in the 19th century said that Piatt had a corrupt personality and that he couldn't abide abolitionists. Well, that was not true. When Piatt was in his 20s, he got 900 of his fellow Ohioans to send a petition to Congress protesting the admission of Texas as a slave state to the Union. At least twice as a young man, Piatt had helped to defend abolitionist editors from pro-slavery mobs in Cincinnati. And one of Piatt's close friends was a great abolitionist who became Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. And after the Civil War, Donn Piatt spoke out strongly in person through his newspaper too for the advancement of African Americans. So in a word, I decided that there was work to be done to produce a better, a truer picture of Piatt, and so here finally is my book. I say finally because it took longer than I'd expected. I kept finding new stuff in archives across the country. For example, in the archives of the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia, I found amazing correspondence between Donn Piatt, former Union Army officer, and Jefferson Davis, former Confederate president. It had a lot to do with Davis's memoirs that Appleton and Company had published in New York. And the book didn't sell well. It sold something like 20 or 22,000 copies, whereas in contrast, when U.S. Grant's memoirs had been published just after his death, they had sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Well, old Mr. Davis decided there was a northern conspiracy against his book, and he asked Donn Piatt to represent him. Piatt got a good lawyer and found that Appleton did owe Davis some money. And he also realized that the memoir was, in fact, not a very good book. But the question was, how did Jefferson Davis and Donn Piatt get together? I'm not sure, but I think it was probably through a mutual friend who was another former Confederate leader who both before and after the war was a member of the Congress. Later still, after the war, was U.S. Secretary of the Interior and ended his career as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. This was Lucius Lamar. To give him his full name, he was Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar. He was a rather shy man, but in post-war Washington, he and Donn Piatt became good friends, and I think perhaps Lamar put Piatt and Davis together. Again, as regards archives, I have to mention the Piatt Castles in western Ohio. Now, Donn Piatt was born, as I mentioned, in 1819 in Cincinnati. His father was a lawyer who got rich on real estate in Cincinnati, and when Donn was 10 years old, 1829, his father retired from the practice of law and moved his family north 100 miles to a tract of 1,700 acres that he had gotten in payment for a legal fee. It was idyllic countryside. There were still patches of the virgin forest, and there were still some of the original inhabitants, the Shawnee. This had been the original Shawnee homeland, as far as anyone knows. And young Donn grew up, his first biographer says, grew up passionately fond of the forest. And although in later years he went to work in Cincinnati and then here in Washington, and then at the age of 68 went to New York to become an editor of a big magazine, although he became something of a city man, he always hearkened back to the country place where he was born, where he was grown up. It was called Makoche, after a Shawnee village that had once stood there. After the Civil War, Donn Piatt and his beloved younger brother Abram built themselves twin chateaus at Makoche. The two houses are still there, and today they're called the Piatt Castles. The houses and about 80 acres of the original land now belong to Margaret Piatt, who's a descendant of Abram. They're open to the public, the two houses. The countryside around them is still unspoiled. And next time you find yourselves around Columbus or Dayton or Springfield, Ohio, you should really pay a visit. It's worthwhile. But I first went to the Piatt Castles, not for pleasure, but for work. I found, when I started getting interested in Donn Piatt, that Margaret Piatt had recently hired an archivist to put Donn's papers in order. Thanks to Margaret and to our archivist, I could and I did spend days and weeks going through the hundreds and hundreds of letters exchanged between Donn and the famous and influential people of his time. Hundreds of articles and essays and poems that he'd written, some of them published, some of them not. And then scrapbooks of newspaper articles from around the country with articles quoting Donn Piatt. Not just the Atlanta Constitution, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, but the Daily Leader of Davenport, Iowa, the Daily Tribune of Bismarck, North Dakota, and the Daily Northwestern in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. These archives are a tremendously rich resource, and I'm not sure, frankly, that any writer had gone into them before I did. Now let me tell you some of the things that Donn Piatt did in his long life besides being a diplomat and running a Washington newspaper. He was always a political man. When he was just 21 studying law in the Ohio countryside, he decided that he was a Democrat, not a Whig like his father. And he and a friend started the first Democratic newspaper in Logan County. They called it the Democratic Club. They pulled no punches, and Donn Piatt got into more than one real fight with punches, and the Democrats lost the election of 1840, but that did not deter him. As the years went by, like many Americans of his time, he changed parties more than once. He became a successful lawyer. He married a lovely young woman from a rich family in Cincinnati named Louise Kirby, and they ran a kind of a literary salon up at Makoche that attracted all the great people of Ohio, the artists, the writers, the politicians. And he became, in that way, a good friend of Edwin Stanton and Salmon P. Chase, who were later to be cabinet members in Lincoln's cabinet. Donn Piatt worked hard. He worked successfully to get Chase elected to the U.S. Senate in 1849, the only senator ever elected from the Free Soil Party. By 1860, after he'd come back from his diplomatic service in France, Donn Piatt was, I think, one of the main political operatives in Ohio. he joined the new Republican Party, and he initially hoped that his friend Salmon Chase would be the Republican candidate for the White House in 1860. But of course, Lincoln won the nomination. And then Piatt agreed to join his friend Robert Skank, who was Lincoln's old comrade in Congress, joined Skank in campaigning for Lincoln in Illinois. The two men spoke together in 9 towns and cities around the state, finally in Springfield. And in Springfield, Lincoln came to hear him, and Lincoln was much taken with Donn Piatt. And he said to the two men that if I win, come on back. Well, he won, they came back. And he was looking at them carefully. Lincoln knew that he needed a cabinet member from the big, populous, important state of Ohio. And he wanted that cabinet member to be Salmon Chase, but he wasn't sure that Chase would accept. Chase had just been his rival for the nomination. So he had to have alternatives. One of them was obviously Robert Skank, his old friend from Congress, and one of them was Donn Piatt. And when Lincoln went up to Chicago after the election to meet leading Republicans and his new Vice President Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, why, he took along with him Skank, and he took both Donn and Louise Piatt along. Louise and Mary Todd Lincoln got on famously together, and Donn Piatt and Abraham Lincoln told each other funny stories, and Skank wrote to his daughter that Abe and Donn were as close as 2 fingers in a glove. But then Donn Piatt said too much. He told Lincoln there was going to be a war. Well, Lincoln was pretty sure there was going to be a war, but he didn't want to discuss that. Lincoln kept on, though. He said that in 3 months, the countryside was going to be covered with white army tents. Lincoln said to Piatt, the fall in pork prices in Cincinnati has affected your mind. Cincinnati was the pork capital of the country. And then it seems Donn Piatt lost his temper, and he said to the president-elect, you might not even make it to your inauguration. And that did it. Lincoln decided he didn't want this intemperate fellow anywhere around him. When the war started, as it did, Skank got a commission as Brigadier General. Lincoln gave Piatt nothing, and at the age of 41, Donn Piatt enlisted in the Union Army as a private. He didn't stay a private for very long. In those days, companies could elect their officers. His fellow soldiers elected him their captain. And then General Skank invited Donn Piatt to become his adjutant general and deputy. And they were together, Skank and Piatt, for 3 years, starting with the first Battle of Bull Run, where we know Piatt stood his ground and tried, without success, to rally the Union troops as they ran away from the Southerners. By 1863, Skank was the commanding general of the Middle Department, which was headquartered in Baltimore. And Piatt, now a lieutenant colonel, was still his deputy. Well, Maryland was still a slave state, you may know. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued at the beginning of the year, but that freed slaves only in the rebel states. Maryland was in the Union, although there were, of course, many Southern sympathizers there and not too many pro-Lincoln people. Lincoln had gotten only 2.5% of the Maryland vote in 1860. But eventually, Lincoln agreed with Skank and Piatt, who wanted to recruit Maryland blacks for the Union Army. And they recruited a couple of thousand men, not just free men, but slaves. And then Skank left town for a few days. Piatt took charge of the department, and he ordered that only slaves should be recruited for the new regiments. Well, the Maryland slave owners were enraged, and they went to their friends in Washington, and they had influential friends here for sure. So Piatt got a telegram instructing him to come down to Washington post haste. He came down, he went to the War Department thinking he would see Mr. Stanton. He was told to go to the White House, and he saw Mr. Lincoln. And Lincoln was furious. Maryland, indeed, was a sensitive place, and what Piatt had done meant trouble, potentially, that Lincoln just didn't want. Piatt said the president cursed him and threatened to kick him out of the Army. And a couple of months later, when Skank left his command to take a seat in Congress, the governor of Delaware and a number of influential people in Maryland asked the president to replace Skank with Piatt and promote Piatt to general. Lincoln said no. Lincoln said, he knows too much, never could understand who's boss. So Donn Piatt served in the Union Army for 3 years, and then he went home to Ohio to his wife, Louise, who was 38 and very sick. I think she had heart trouble. She died later that year at only 38. His friend Horace Greeley wrote Donn that he was very sorry at her loss, and he knew that Donn would never have another romance. Well, Horace Greeley was wrong in a number of things, and that was one of the things he was wrong about. Donn married Louise's younger sister, Ella, and they lived happily together for a quarter century until Donn died in 1891. Now, I'll add that Donn Piatt liked women, and they liked him. He apparently was very physically attractive. And he was also good about encouraging and publishing women writers, women like Helen Hamilton Gardner, who was not just a Piatt contributor, but a leading suffragist, and later became the first woman member of the U.S. Civil Service Commission. Whether Piatt had any extramarital affairs, I'm not sure. He was devoted to his second wife, Ella, but she was partially paralyzed for years. And during those years, she was certainly a close friend of the most famous, if not the best actress in America, Clara Morris. As you can see from a photograph in my book, she was quite a good-looking woman. And in fact, he even wrote a play for her that was put on in New York without tremendous success, I must say. Now, one of the things that Piatt reminded people of, that people remembered about Donn for years after his death, was that President Grant had him put in jail. That happened in early 1877 when Grant's second last term was ending. The contest to succeed the president was between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat. Tilden won the popular vote, but the electoral votes were tied. There were 20 votes in dispute. And finally, a commission named by Congress awarded the votes to Hayes, and he was proclaimed the winner. Now, Hayes and Piatt had been friends since the 1850s, when Piatt was a judge in Cincinnati and arranged for Hayes, who was a struggling young lawyer, to get a number of law cases. They were both members of the Literary Club of Cincinnati. They served together in the war. But when the commission gave the election to Hayes, Piatt was outraged. He published an editorial in the Capitol saying, and I quote, that if a man thus returned to power can ride in safety from the executive mansion to the inauguration, we are fitted for the slavery that will follow. Well, that was fiery stuff. And Grant had Piatt arrested for inciting riot and rebellion. Probably had some reason to do so. But Piatt was not the only person who was saying things like that. A former Union general named James Stedman spoke in Toledo, and he offered to lead 100,000 men to Washington. And a former Union general named Thomas Ewing said in Columbus that if Hayes should be inaugurated, the people should resist, even if it meant a call to arms. Well, Piatt got out of jail quickly on $5,000 bail. Hayes was inaugurated without incident, and Hayes dropped the charges against him. And within several months, Piatt had decided that Hayes was actually a pretty good president. The two were suddenly friends again, and Hayes and his wife invited the Piatts to their silver wedding anniversary. But people remembered what Piatt had written, and across the country they always searched their papers for some new Piatt quip or caustic comment. I want to be clear that Donn Piatt is not my hero. I have two heroes. One is Nathaniel Davis, who was my first boss in the Foreign Service, the most dedicated Foreign Service officer I knew and a great ambassador. And my other hero is Tomáš Masaryk, who founded the Czechoslovak Republic and served as its president until he turned 85. As far as Donn Piatt is concerned, he did admirable things, but as I have made clear in my book, his ethics came into question, and he was much criticized at the time when he worked as a Washington lobbyist while at the same time running his newspaper. He made no bones about being a lobbyist, and as I'm not the first to point out, why the role of lobbyists in 1870s and 1880s Washington was already an important one. At that time, members of Congress typically had no staff at all. They had to do their own research, write their own speeches, and a lobbyist could and often did provide a member with useful information that he needed in shaping legislation. But by the time that Piatt worked as a lobbyist, mainly for a company that got a contract to moth-proof old Union Army uniforms from the war, why ethical standards in Washington were making clear that a journalist should avoid such conflicts of interest. Now, Piatt was not the only journalist with such conflicts. Henry Raymond, for example, who founded the New York Times, at the same time that he was running his paper, chaired the Republican National Committee. Piatt was also widely criticized for his support of Alexander Shepard, who was the head of public works for the District of Columbia and briefly the territorial governor of the district under Grant. Shepard's actions and ethics can be questioned, but it was Shepard who gave America a modern capital, planting thousands of trees, paving streets, putting in adequate water mains, gas lines, sewer system, and building schools and markets. Shepard was never prosecuted, but he was looked down on for many decades, and his statue that was in front of the district government building was taken down for some years. But it was put back 7 years ago, and my friend John Richardson is just now completing the biography of Shepard, which I think is going to be very interesting reading. My focus is on Donn Piatt. I call him a gadfly, and he was indeed just that. He goaded and he pricked and he mocked a long list of high and mighty men. He was an early muckraker, although it was not until Theodore Roosevelt came along that that term was used. If Piatt had his faults, so did these later muckrakers like Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair. Tarbell visited Italy in 1926. That was 4 years after Mussolini had seized power. And Mussolini had cracked down on the opposition. He had had his main opponent murdered. And Ida Tarbell came to Italy, saw what she wanted to, came back home, and she praised what she called the Duce's admirable social experiment. And as to Upton Sinclair, he went to the Soviet Union in 1937. Stalin's purges were well underway by that time. And when he came home, he quoted Emerson about people needing to hitch their wagon to a star. And he said that the Soviet star was the biggest and the brightest one in the sky. I don't think that Donn Piatt, if he had lived a few more decades than he did, I don't think that Piatt would ever have said such things. Now, you'll understand by now, I don't think Donn Piatt deserves to be forgotten. I don't have time to tell you everything that he accomplished before he died. He published his most important work when he was 68. This is a book called Memories of the Men Who Saved the Union. And it told readers flatly what he had seen firsthand of Lincoln, Stanton, Chase, and a whole string of generals. He said that Lincoln was the greatest man they'd ever known, and he'd seen a lot of them. But Lincoln, he said, was no God, and we already had enough saints. Besides, he said, Lincoln really had grave faults. He was descended from poor whites in a slave state, and even though he himself disliked slavery, he inherited, Piatt said, the contempt, if not the hatred, held by that class for African Americans. Of course, he was widely criticized for saying such things about the martyred president, but he called things the way he saw them. There's a lot more in my book that I don't have time to tell you about now. His work as a lawyer and a judge, novelist, playwright, poet, an historian of the Civil War, a relatively unbiased historian of the Civil War. His hero in that war was George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and I think that Piatt's biography of Thomas is an important contribution to the history of the Civil War. He was a pretty good poet, too, although he had a woman cousin by marriage, who was a better one. That was Sarah Bryan Piatt, who sometimes is being compared as second only to Emily Dickinson as the second greatest woman poet of America's 19th century. He was also a good friend of poets. One of his good friends was James Whitcomb Riley. Riley liked to come over to Indiana to visit Piatt at Maquachee. And Riley published a long poem of praise for Piatt and the other famous people that Piatt had hosted at Maquachee. Now, looking at that arch political man, Donn Piatt, and he was an arch political man, you have to ask why he never gained national office. And I've gone into that in my book. Aside from his diplomatic post, the only federal appointment he ever had was as the postmaster of Maquachee at a salary of $40 a year. Of course, he wrote a self-mocking article or two about his heavy new responsibilities as postmaster. And of course, he sent his friend, the second assistant postmaster general, Adlai Stevenson, the first Adlai Stevenson, a lot of recommendation based on his work at Maquachee on how to improve the postal system across the country. I've also in my book addressed the possibility that Piatt may have turned initially against Grant and against the Grant administration because he'd hoped for an appointment in that administration, maybe a diplomatic appointment, and been turned down. I found some evidence of that, and in fact I found it in the manuscript room at the Library of Congress. But to conclude, even if Piatt didn't get a top job in government, he did play an important role in our past, an interesting role, I think. And as Americans, from George Santayana to Arthur Schlesinger, if not beyond, as people have warned us, if we don't know our past, we're going to be disabled in dealing with both our present and our future. And so I've tried to bring Donn Piatt and his times back to life, but only the reader can judge if I've succeeded. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'd be happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
How did you research this book, Peter?
When?
How long did you research this? Peter, can you repeat the question?
How long did it take me to do the research? Well, John said something about my having spoken here a couple of years ago. It was 10 years ago. And it must have been not too long after that that I began to think about Donn Piatt. I wrote an article about Piatt to begin with. That's in the electronic journal American Diplomacy. And then I thought, well, maybe I will undertake a book. I'm not, I suppose, a trained scholar, but I had published a biography of Daniel that had several hundred endnotes, and that takes a long time to do that sort of stuff, but I decided, well, I needed to keep my aging mind working, and so I went to work on Piatt. But I suppose, all in all, I did 4 or 5 years of work, not full-time, of course. I was climbing mountains with friends in Colorado and doing all sorts of good things, but I suppose 4 or 5 years. And my resources were even richer. As I mentioned, the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia, the director of the Jefferson Davis papers at Rice University was of great help in locating letters exchanged between Davis and Piatt. University archives and all sorts of places I came on. But I would say that I did certainly more of my research in this library and also in the National Archives and in a couple of other universities round about here than anywhere else. My book on Daniel, I had relied heavily on what I found in the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond. And it occurred to me, I think about a couple of years ago, maybe I should go take a look at the Virginia Historical Society, since Piatt had worked for this Virginian in Paris. And I went down there, and my God, there in the papers, in the archives, were these letters that Piatt had written from Washington to his boss in Paris. He'd been sent back here with dispatches on the Ostend Manifesto, which was a meeting of ministers basically saying that if Spain wouldn't sell us Cuba, we'd take it away from them by force. But anyway, Piatt came back here with dispatches. He saw the president, he saw the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, he saw the Secretary of State, he saw almost every cabinet member, an amazing source. So I came on these things in somewhat unexpected places. Yes, sir?
You talked about his abolitionist sort of tendencies, not wanting to expand slavery in the territories, not wanting African Americans or blacks to serve in the army in Maryland, the Maryland and African Americans. Do you have any other opinions about black people after the war?
That's a good question, and indeed, he did. He was not an abolitionist, by the by. I mean, his friend... Oh, I'm sorry, the question. More about Piatt and abolitionist or not, and his actions after the war. I was saying that he was not an abolitionist. His friend Salmon Chase was an abolitionist. Piatt believed that the laws provided for slavery in slave states, and he didn't want to see expansion of slavery into new states, but he was not, per se, an abolitionist. When the war ended, he ran, or sometime after the war ended, he ran for the Ohio legislature. And one of the things he said very clearly is, we don't want all those poor blacks moving up from the South. Now, Ohio is well known as a place where a number of routes of the Underground Railroad traverse the state. But what's important to know is that these Underground Railroad routes traversed the state, and slaves went through Ohio, but most of them, if I'm not wrong, went farther north into Ontario. And the number of blacks in the Ohio population before the war was something under 3%, maybe under 2%, and even after the war, it was not great. So Piatt, although, as I mentioned, he spoke out for the advancement of African Americans, said very plainly he didn't want poor black ex-slaves as his neighbors. On the other hand, when he came here, I found an interesting account in the paper, Washington Star, I think, that he and his friend Alexander Shepard had spoken together at an election rally soon after the war, and he said very plainly to the black population of Washington, this is your city as well as ours. I want you to advance as fast as you can. And he wrote in his paper a number of success stories, in fact, of African Americans who had succeeded, who were succeeding in Washington and across the country. I dropped his name, but I can't think of it. A graduate of Oberlin who became the first dean of the Howard University Law School, for example. Anyway, it was from our point of view, I suppose his views on blacks were not politically correct. They were not rare for his time, but he did, even if he didn't want ex-slaves as his neighbors, he wanted to see the advancement of African Americans. He went down to Louisville after the war and he spoke at a Congress on African American education that was pushing very hard for free public education in the state of Kentucky for blacks as well as whites. That answers the question. So. Anyone else? Sir.
Did you start writing after your retirement, or did you have some ambitions to
Did I start writing after retirement? Which retirement? I retired from the State Department. I retired from the federal government in 1986.
I know, but you worked for various foundations, so after your
I think I always wanted to be a writer, and even when I was in the Foreign Service, I published a few things in the Foreign Service Journal, the Journal of the American Foreign Service Association. Sometimes I confess now under a pseudonym because the department wouldn't have much liked what I wrote. And then afterwards I found a niche writing articles for the Los Angeles Times, and then went to work for a large corporation which made clear they had no interest in me writing articles for the newspapers. So there was some, pent-up demand in me for wanting to write that I had to postpone for a few years. And so it was finally, I suppose, in the mid-90s that I started to write more in earnest.
I'm asking this question because about 36 years ago, I had met you in Udine and Pordenone when the Friuli earthquake occurred, and I noticed that you were a talented raconteur.
I'm sorry, did you hear? In Pordenone?
In Pordenone and Udine,
Yeah.
on the occasion of the Friuli earthquake. You were charged with perhaps one of your less glamorous missions there. And we had opportunities to talk a lot, and I noticed that you were a talented raconteur.
I didn't know I was a talented raconteur, but I certainly went to Friuli after the earthquakes. It was a really memorable experience. What had happened was that after the earthquakes in Sicily a decade earlier, the U.S. Congress had appropriated quite a lot of money for reconstruction work in Sicily. And when the earthquakes occurred in Friuli in '76, why the Friulani are rather independent, self-reliant people, but the American Congress decided they needed help. They appropriated quite a lot of money. And I went along with the A-team to make sure that the A-team was, I guess you'd say, politically correct. But I don't remember anything about being a raconteur. And I never published anything about the earthquakes, but it's a very, very strong memory in my mind. Nice to see you here. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Peter. You are a wonderful presenter, and you've brought back lots of memories, including my lack of memory. It was really 10 years ago when you were here?
I think so.
Well, we can check that out. But at any rate, congratulations on the book. The book is available if you would like to buy a copy at the Library of Congress discount and get it signed by the author. We would appreciate it. And one more time, let's give a round of applause to Peter Bridges.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.